Why did Germany lose World War I, and could it have won? In this video, I'm going to discuss the views of one of its participants, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler devoted extensive attention to the First World War in Mein Kampf, treating it not merely as a formative personal experience, but as a comprehensive lesson in what he believed Germany had done wrong, and what must never be repeated. For Hitler, the war was not lost on the battlefield, but sabotaged internally through political weakness, moral restraint, and ideological enemies. His reflections on propaganda, discipline, leadership, and internal repression formed the intellectual foundation for the later conduct of the Nazi state and its wars. Central to Hitler's critique was what he regarded as the catastrophic failure of German wartime propaganda. In his view, propaganda had been timid, confused, and morally compromised. He argued that propaganda must serve a single ruthless purpose, sustaining the will of a nation engaged in a struggle for survival. The war's objective, he claimed, had been nothing less than the freedom and independence of our people, the security of food for the future, and honour of the nation. There I'm quoting directly from Mein Kampf. Because the stakes were existential, propaganda could not be guided by ethical or aesthetic considerations. When nations fight for survival, Hitler wrote, all notions of humanity, compassion, or beauty become irrelevant. For Hitler, propaganda was not a matter of truth or persuasion, but of psychological domination. Its task was to mobilize instinct, suppress doubt, and eliminate hesitation. He ridiculed what he saw as Germany's pacifist messaging and accused liberal politicians of attempting to inspire sacrifice with moral platitudes rather than emotional coercion. In his formulation, effective propaganda had to simplify reality into absolute categories: friend and enemy, survival and annihilation, and relentlessly reinforce them. Anything less was weakness. He contrasted this implicitly and explicitly with what he admired in Allied propaganda, which he believed was far more brutal, emotional, and effective. This worldview extended directly into Hitler's conception of discipline and punishment during wartime. One of his most persistent grievances was the suspension, or at least the limited use, of the death penalty within the Imperial German Army during the later stages of the war. He believed that this leniency fatally undermined discipline. According to Hitler, the mere threat of imprisonment was meaningless to soldiers who daily faced death in the trenches. For a frightened or demoralized soldier, prison could appear preferable to the front. Only the certainty of execution, he argued, could deter desertion. Hitler framed desertion not as a human response to industrialized slaughter, but as moral corruption. In his logic, a soldier must face death in battle or face death for refusal. Anything in between represented a collapse of authority. From this perspective, he argued that Imperial Germany had effectively invited mass desertion by failing to enforce the ultimate sanction. In his telling, tens of thousands of deserters flooded the rear areas in 1918 and formed the social basis of revolution. The collapse of discipline at the front thus became, in his narrative, the precondition for political collapse at home. These ideas were not rhetorical excesses, they later became policy. During the Second World War, the Nazi regime constructed an enormous and brutal system of military justice. More than 1,000 military courts and thousands of legal officials served the Wehrmacht. Their purpose was not justice in any conventional sense, but the preservation of fighting capacity at any cost. Millions of cases passed through these courts. Tens of thousands of death sentences were imposed on soldiers accused of desertion, defeatism, or undermining military morale, as the official vernacular put it, while hundreds of thousands more were criminalized. This system reflected Hitler's belief that terror, not loyalty, were the true foundation of military obedience. Hitler explicitly linked this system to the interpretation of the First World War. In his mind, Germany's defeat was the inevitable result of failing to eliminate internal enemies early on and decisively. The events of November 1918 were not, in his account, a spontaneous revolution or a response to military defeat, but the culmination of deliberate betrayal. He portrayed deserters, socialists and revolutionaries as a single criminal conspiracy that exploited Germany's restraint. Hitler's contempt extended to Germany's wartime political leadership. He reserved a particular scorn for Reich Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, who he dismissed as a philosophizing weakling. In Hitler's view, Germany had been cursed with intellectuals and compromisers at a moment when it required ruthless leadership. He argued that if Germany had been led by a robust man of the people, the sacrifices of frontline soldiers would not have been wasted. Political moderation, negotiation, and legality were, in his view, fatal weaknesses in an existential conflict. Kaiser Wilhelm II also featured prominently in Hitler's indictment of the imperial system. Hitler accused the Kaiser of committing a fundamental betrayal by seeking reconciliation with Marxist organizations during the war. In Hitler's conspiratorial anti-Semitic framework, Marxism was not merely a political ideology, but a Jewish instrument of national destruction. Any attempt at compromise was therefore not statesmanship, but capitulation. He argued that there could be no agreements with such enemies, only annihilation. Hitler claimed that August 1914 had presented Germany with a unique opportunity. With international socialist solidarity temporarily collapsing and German workers rallying to the nation, the state should, in his view, have acted decisively to eliminate socialist and Marxist leaders. Instead, by extending reconciliation and legal protection, the Kaiser allegedly allowed these forces to regroup and prepare revolution. Hitler's language here was explicit and exterminatory. Those he labelled vermin should have been eradicated. This rhetoric was not metaphorical. It reflected an early articulation of genocidal logic, political opponents defined as biological threats. In Hitler's narrative, the army itself was exempt from blame. He consistently portrayed the Imperial Army as the highest moral and educational institution of the German nation, the most powerful school of the people. The army, he argued, had taught Germans unity, discipline, and national identity, inoculating them against ideas of international solidarity or class brotherhood. The German soldier of the First World War was elevated into an eternal symbol of heroism. Accordingly, military defeat could not explain Germany's collapse. Hitler dismissed claims of battlefield failure as deliberate lies. The setbacks of August 1918, he insisted, were manageable. Germany was not defeated by enemy armies, but by internal sabotage. He cited strikes, particularly in the armaments industry, as decisive acts of treason that crippled Germany at the decisive moment. In this interpretation, the enemy within mattered more than the enemy at the front. At the centre of this internal enemy stood the Jew. Hitler portrayed Jews as uniquely responsible for Germany's defeat, revolution, and post-war suffering. In some of the most extreme passages of Mein Kampf, he speculated that the mass gassing of Jewish leaders at the outset of war would have saved millions of German lives. This was not a rhetorical flourish, but an early articulation of genocidal thinking, framed as utilitarian necessity. The 9th of November 1918 became, in his mind, a Jewish crime demanding future vengeance. From these conclusions, Hitler derived a program. Germany could never again allow internal enemies to exist during wartime. The conditions of 1918 must never be repeated. As the Nazi regime prepared for war, Jews were systematically excluded from public life, state institutions, and eventually from German society altogether. Hitler argued that Judaism represented a uniquely dangerous element in military conflicts, an internal corrosive force that had to be isolated and destroyed before external war could be won. Thus, Hitler's interpretation of the First World War was not a retrospective lament, but a blueprint. His conclusions shaped Nazi propaganda, military justice, political repression, and ultimately the regime's genocidal policies. In this sense, Mein Kampf was not merely an ideological autobiography, it was a programmatic rehearsal for the dictatorship and war that followed. So thanks very much for listening. Hope you found it interesting. I'm in the process of preparing videos on Mein Kampf and World War II and Mein Kampf and Operation Barbarossa. So if you think that this was interesting, then you might want to ask me to do that as well. I upload every day at 2000 hours Central European time. On Tuesdays and Fridays, I do longer videos, documentary length, such as this one here. I also offer channel membership. Channel membership costs £5, €6 or $6, and that now gives you access to more than 800 members-only videos. For the moment, from me, thanks for listening, and bye for now.